When my mom's dementia got worse, life started to feel completely overwhelming to me. There were days when everything seemed to be spinning out of control. Schedules were disrupted. Everything in general got disrupted, and life was just out of control. And during that time, I found myself turning to something that might seem a little bit odd, but it was Linux and the world of open source software in general. For me, it wasn't really about learning a new system or learning a new operating system. It was about finding one place where I could still break things and rebuild them and feel some sense of control or a sense of agency. So I started my journey with Linux Mint. A lot of people recommend Mint as a starting point because it's stable and it's very user friendly. And it's a great recommendation because it is a really good operating system. And especially for somebody who's just kind of dipping their toes into the world of Linux. So, in spite of that, my first installations of Mint were incredibly clumsy. I'd always managed to mess around with things until it just wasn't working the way I wanted it to. So I'd uninstall it. Then I'd reinstall it. And I did that 3 or 4 times. But after a month or two, I finally got it right. Mint had become my everyday operating system. Then I decided, you know what, I need a media server. So it's something to simple to make it easy to watch movies and listen to music at home. So enter Open Media Vault. I broke Open Media Vault so many times that I lost count. I installed it, reinstalled it, reconfigured it, started over, installed it again, reinstalled, reconfigured, and rinse and repeat over and over again. At first, it was incredibly frustrating. I would mistype commands into the command line. I'd run commands that shouldn't be run, forget to run commands that were needed. But then I started to notice something. Every time I messed up, I learned something new. None of the mistakes were final. They were all just steps in the learning process. And that's when it really hit me. The command line isn't really just about typing commands. It mirrors resilience. You break things, you learn, you rebuild. It's iterative, just like life is iterative. So, some of the lessons I've learned along the way. First one, patience. You can't rush the process. Sometimes you just have to step away before a solution to some problem you're experiencing is going to appear. Human beings have this amazing capacity for intuition. When we allow our unconscious mind to become part of the problem solving process, we can sometimes find answers and solutions that were evading us otherwise. But you have to have the patience to persevere through the process and step away when you need to step away. Otherwise, that intuitive process will never be allowed to kick in. The second thing I've learned is something about agency or control. Um, a lot of times we think when we fail that we've lost control, but that's not really true. Even when you mess up, you could always start again. That's not failure, that's empowerment. And finally, growth. This all started as kind of a survival process for me. I needed something that I could grab onto that wasn't elusive, that wasn't changing constantly, that gave me a sense of control. But what happened along the way is this became more about a personal growth journey for me. I was learning things. I was developing new skills. I was taking on new tasks that I had never considered before. So this really became curiosity for its own sake, which has been incredibly rewarding in and of itself. So, open source software, the world of Linux, it's really just a metaphor. It's a metaphor for freedom. It's the freedom to learn, the freedom to adapt, and the freedom to rebuild. You're never really alone on the journey either. Someone else has always broken the same thing that you broke, messed up the same command that you messed up, and there's a community out there that's ready to help. The progress we make, it's not about never failing. It's not about perfection. It's about iterating. And that's a lesson that goes way beyond the technology itself. So I started this journey about a year ago. And looking back, I really wish I had taken the time to document all of the steps that I took along the way. I've learned a lot, not just about using the command line. I've learned a lot about myself too, about building that sense of agency and that sense of resilience. Technology can be so frustrating, but it can also be incredibly empowering. And that's what I really want to focus on in this channel. Not another how-to channel. There's plenty of how-to channels out there, and they're produced by knowledgeable people with far greater skills than I possess. Instead, I'm going to be focusing on resilience, empowerment, and well-being in technology, in society, and in life in general. So please take a moment to like and subscribe. And if you're interested in more content about building resilience and empowerment and well-being, check out the Quiet Frontier website that I've linked in the description. And thanks again so much for watching. I really appreciate the time you've taken to check out this video. And I hope to see you in the next video. Until then, take good care.
There's not much difference day to day. No time to stop and pray to my God. Won't you grant me some relief? Obligations and ordeals, my